everybody. Today's colloquium for the Genius Institute. Today we're going to be having Richard Muller speak to us about Thomism and William Ames. And we have a good group of people here, a good turnout. And so without any further ado, Dr. Muller.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope that what is a work in progress comes out okay. Just broadly to begin with, one of the significant metaphysical issues that confronts theologians, reformed among them in the early modern era, and I think in addition one of the really significant indices to medieval backgrounds, was the issue of divine ideas, specifically ideas of possibles and the relationship of these ideas to the divine intellect. Now that sounds a little bit abstruse. I think some of you are probably scratching your head, why should I worry about divine ideas and possibles? And I asked myself, how do I introduce this? Well, suppose you had no ideas in your head. I've encountered a few students like that, so it's possible. But suppose you had absolutely no ideas in your head, and somebody said to you, make me a table. What would you do? You wouldn't know. You wouldn't be able to make the table. Now, jack that up ontologically a few steps into creation ex nihilo, where, it's one thing to say that God creates matter out of nothing. Okay, I can buy that. But how does God create horses out of the matter that he's creating out of nothing? Where does he get the idea of a horse from? If you have the idea of a horse somewhere else outside of God, you become Plato, then you have created a realm of something that is in some way superior to God. And you've given ontic status to ideas, and God is now beholden to them, and in some way limited. So it's a big question. It's a really important question, and particularly in the early modern era, where there are alternative philosophies being dredged up out of classical antiquity, the whole idea of creation ex nihilo and also of ideas in God becomes fairly important, as it had been in the medieval tradition. Discussion of those ideas, or you might call them eternal exemplars in the divine mind, was not frequently found among Reformed writers of the 16th century. I haven't found much indication of it in early, what you might call codifiers like Musculus or Hyperius or Ursinus or Lambert Dano. Not that it's not there, I just maybe haven't found it yet. There is some development of this in Zonki. And Zonki does a little bit with the idea, and he's arguably echoing Aquinas. There's a bit in Junius. There's some in Paulinus, who puts it mostly in his discussion of creation. So there's a background there. Sharpius does say that God is being through himself, and all else is being by participation. There's a little bit of Thomist language there. Others of that group, like Buchanan or Perkins and Trocasius, don't appear to have discussed these issues at all. What is interesting then is that of that generation of writers, there is an extended discussion of divine ideas that you find in the final editions of William Ames' Marrow of Theology. And as you know, he's the English Puritan professor who serves the University of Franeker in Friesland. He takes up the issue, and after him, quite a few take it up. Perhaps they're building it on Zonki, Paulinus, and Ames, but given that those that pick it up after Ames include Maccovius, who taught with him, they had differences over beverages, but they did agree a lot in their theology. And then Petrus von Maastricht, who discusses this and particularly mentions William Ames. There's some reason to say that Ames is one of the major pivots that brings this language into the Reformed tradition. And then after Ames, you also have Kloppenborg discussing it, Morasius, Asenius, and among the English, Stephen Charnock. Ames provides a really suitable focus for discussing this, inasmuch as he is one of the primary formulators of the idea in Reformed orthodoxy. He does approach the issue in greater detail than Zanchi, and arguably with more precision. His understanding of divine ideas, as also is the case with approaches of his Reformed contemporaries, is governed by a series of definitions concerning the divine essence and attributes. Inasmuch as the divine essence is one and exists immutably of itself, God is recognized as pure act, which is to say that God is fully actualized and devoid of passive potency. Attributes are attributes of God, attributes to God. Rather than being in God in the manner that they're in creatures, they are in God, as Ames says, as one pure and utterly simple act. Still, he tells you, it's not incorrect to think of attributes as distinguished from the essence and among themselves, although not merely rationally or reasoningly, but Ames says, according to a process of reasoning such that the foundation of the distinction is in God himself. A distinction made by reasoning with a foundation in the thing is basically a Thomist definition. So we have a kind of Thomist input at that point in Ames. In carrying that basic view of the divine attributes forward, Ames indicates that the divine intellect is also simple, immutable, eternal, and infinite. As simple, the intellectus Dei is devoid of composition, discourse, and representation, separate representations of individual things. As infinite, it comprehends all truths and the grounds or reasons of all things. There's a significant distinction to be made between the representations of individual things, Ames notes, which is foreign to the divine intellect, and the comprehension of the truths or reasons of all things that does belong to the divine intellect. If God had representations of individual things, that would imply a knowledge grounded in things. If God has a comprehension of the truths or reasons of all things, that doesn't imply a knowledge grounded in things. And back off to creation ex nihilo again. God's initial knowledge of what things are can't be grounded in things. In what's arguably a reformed adaptation of the placement and use of the argument, if not the argument itself, Ames places his discussion of divine ideas in his locus concerning the eternal decree and counsel of God, not as Aquinas did in the first part of the Summa, among the divine attributes, specifically in relation to the knowledge of God. No, Ames puts it into the decree and counsel. His placement of the discussion indicates address to a set of problems somewhat different from those addressed by Aquinas, as also from Zanchi, who followed Aquinas on the order of the topic. Aquinas had argued the issue from the perspective of the divine essence and the assumption that God knows all things through himself, potentially ruling out the existence of ideas in God, or granting that there can be ideas in God as distinct and separate, whether the divine simplicity and essential identity of all that God is, when it does rule out multiplicity. Ames, by contrast, doesn't argue those issues at length. He's not particularly worried about the absence of multiplicity of ideas in God. He simply declares that the idea in God is one, doesn't argue it at length, but becomes manifold with respect to the diversity of creatures. Oh, by the way, if you read the 17th century English translation of Ames' Marrow, you won't find any discussion of an idea in God. You'll find the word platform, which is the word that the 17th century translator decided to use to translate idea. Who knows why? But you won't find it in English, you'll find it in the Latin. Ames' focus is on the relationship of divine ideas to the eternal decree that actualizes all things. he identifies divine ideas as the conceptual content of the eternal counsel of God as it is directed toward the ultimate end, the achievement of God's end as appointed by God. And it's therefore the idea, or ideas, uses it both ways, is the conceptual foundation in God for his divine decree. And it is integral to the identification of the decree as utterly free. By his eternal decree, God establishes all things, great and small, contingent, necessary, or free. The decree is God's determinate or definite intention to affect all things by his omnipotence and according to counsel. The premise of Ames' argument is that the goal, or scopus, of the divine counsel is the glory of God as understood as the manifestation of the goodness and perfection of God in and through his efficiency, which is to say, in and through his works ad extra. Although the term counsel itself, when used of human knowing and willing, would imply deliberation, namely a sequence of thought in which knowing temporally precedes willing, Ames says God knows and wills each and everything at once in a simple, eternal act that is only improperly identified as deliberation. The perfection of the divine counsel is threefold. First, in its goal. Second, in the concept or idea of the object in the mind of God, who is the agent or artificer. And third, in its intention, in the ultimate satisfaction or complacencia of the agent in his work. Ames dwells at length on the analogy, both the likeness and the difference between human knowing and willing and divine knowing and willing, based on the different ways that ideas are in the mind of man and in the mind of God. Any agent or artificer, he says, works on the basis of a counsel or deliberative judgment to make things outside of himself. And when he does so, he has an inward idea of the work to be done. There is accordingly some analogy between the divine counsel and operation and the human manner of working. But as Ames comments, God doesn't make things in the manner of natural agents. God doesn't operate blindly or accidentally and doesn't work under coercion, but with the utmost perfection of reason. This perfection of operation, he says, rests in the pre-existence of this idea in God as, quote, the exemplary cause of all things that are to be made, unquote. Ames references Hebrews 11:3 in justification of the point. The things that we see are made from things that do not appear. That's the way he translates it. The ideas of things in the human mind, he indicates, are acquired by analysis. They are gathered from the things themselves, given that in the human way of knowing, the thing or object first exists as itself, externally. Then by way of the senses, an impression of the object enters the understanding. And next, in the understanding, an idea is constituted for the sake of directing some outward act or operation. Just by the way, Thomas Aquinas would agree completely with that as well. By contrast, quote, the idea of all things is the divine essence, understood by God himself as imitable by the creatures, or so as in some manner the perfection of this image or some vestige of it may be expressed in the creatures. That is, those creatures, as they are conceived in the mind of God, are the idea of the nature that they have in themselves. The creature as conceived in the mind of God is the idea of the nature that the creature is going to have ad extra. Similarly, in his Technometria, Ames can pose the question of how divine and human understanding differ. The divine understanding, he says, is archetypal. The human is ectypal, inasmuch as God's knowledge is eternal, standing as the principium or first form, he says, primus tupus, of all things. Whereas human understanding rests on the creation, on the examination of created things. Thus in human beings, things themselves are the exemplar. and our cognition is the image. But in God, the divine knowledge is the exemplar, and the things themselves are its expressed image or similitude. Even so, an idea in the mind of a human being is initially impressed and afterwards expressed, whereas in God, the idea, strictly or properly, is only expressed and not impressed, inasmuch as divine ideas do not arise from anything outside of God. Given that Ames has placed this discussion of divine ideas not in his doctrine of divine essence and attributes, but in his locus or disputation on the divine counsel and decree, he draws on the point that the idea in God is prior to its expression in existent creatures in order to note the proper understanding of divine knowledge and to forestall any conceptions of human merit and foreseen faith. The divine decree cannot depend on a knowledge of creatures or on a foreknowledge of their actions, since then, if this were so, he says, the idea in God would arise in him from another. But this in no way corresponds with God's nature. Ames returns to the point as integral to his doctrine of creation ex nihilo. Before creation, the creatures had no real being, that's esse reale, either of existence or of essence, although they had a known being, esse cognitum, from eternity in the knowledge of God. That statement echoes Aquinas' declaration that God does not understand things according to an idea existing outside of himself. Although one might argue that Ames' usage of the term esse cognitum might include a Scotist accent, inasmuch as Scotus held that God does not know ideas or exemplars in his essence as such, but as produced by the divine intellect, as objects or being of thought. What's lacking in Ames' account, however, is any sense that the esse cognitum is produced by the divine intellect. Rather, in accord with his previous comments, Ames would appear to identify the known being or object of divine knowing as the singular, simple idea, identical with the divine essence, but multiplex as imitable by creatures. That language of imitable by creatures, which Ames uses, is directly out of Thomas Aquinas. So then, if then that term, esse cognitum, is Scotist in origin, it has either been absorbed by Ames, one might say by reverent exposition, into an otherwise Thomist account, or more simply it's become common fare in expanding scholastic vocabulary. Next, divine ideas, possibles, and distinctions in divine knowing. Ames drew on the traditional distinction between two kinds of divine knowledge, namely knowledge of all possibles, defined in an intellectualistic manner as the knowledge of simple intelligence, the scientia simplicis intelligentiae, and knowledge of all future actuality defined as knowledge of vision, scientia visionis. Alternatively, you can frame the same distinction in a voluntaristic manner as between the divine necessary knowledge of all possibles and the divine voluntary knowledge of all future actuals, as to be actualized by the divine will. Although the two forms of the distinction were often used interchangeably by the 17th century, it's potentially important to the case that Ames used the intellectualistic form of the distinction found in Aquinas' treatment of possibles and future actuals rather than the voluntaristic form used by Scotus and Scotists. What God knows according to this knowledge of simple intelligence, or you might call it knowledge of absolute understanding, namely all possibles, possibilia, is an utterly perfect knowledge of everything and of all individual things that could be accomplished by God. God knows this, says Ames, in his omnisufficiency. In contrast to what God knows in his visionary knowledge, namely things that he knows through his efficiency or by decree of his own will. These two categories of divine knowing, moreover, offer a complete view of the ways in which God knows. A middle knowledge, scientia media, understood as hypothetical knowing prior to God's will, cannot, Ames insists, comport with the divine perfection, inasmuch as it establishes future events independently of the divine will. and makes divine knowledge dependent on external object. It's ruled out. The notion of such conjectural knowledge concerning future contingencies, this is a quote, the notion of such conjectural knowledge concerning future contingencies is utterly repugnant to the divine nature and perfection. Even so, Ames distinguishes the objects of divine knowledge, power, and will. The divine knowledge, or scientia, knows all knowables. The divine power, or potentia, references and can accomplish all possibles, including those that are beyond everything that was, is, and will be. The divine will, or voluntas, does not will all possibles, but only those that God determines are suitable to be willed and ultimately to be actualized. God, therefore, is omniscient and omnipotent, but not omnivolent, or omnivolent, if you prefer. What's important for Ames is that the divine ideas, considered prior to God's willing, exist in God as pure possibles, representative of the essence or quiddities of things, and is as such that they're known to God by simple or absolute intelligence. Given the simplicity of the divine essence and the identity of the idea in God with the divine essence, Ames also encounters, although briefly, a problem that profoundly occupied Thomas Aquinas. Namely, if indeed there is essentially but one simple idea in God, how can it be that the idea is understood as many ideas, indeed as the ideational exemplars of many things? Roman Catholic scholar Lawrence Dewan argues, on the basis of Aquinas' treatise on truth, the De Veritate, that the ideas of creatables have their multiplicity, for Thomas, by virtue of their relation to that which is outside the maker, and that the relation is causal. Just by the way, if you want to understand what Protestant Orthodox folk are saying about possibilia, you're not going to find any Protestant authors, secondary sources to help you. You're going to have to read Roman Catholic essays, notably essays about Aquinas and Scotus and the medieval question of possibles. Idea in God, considered absolutely, and here we are back very quickly to Ames, is single inasmuch as it is identical with the one simple divine essence, but considered in its varied respects to the creatures. The idea is multiplex, as Ames. So that the idea of one creature is not the idea of another. Accordingly, the ideas of all creaturely perfections are in God. But as Ames is quick to add, no ideas of imperfections in a formal sense. These ideas of perfections, they're in creatures. Given the divine will to actualize the creature, are understood to be in God as they, quote, arise from his active power. Power there is virtus, not potentia. That requires some explanation and analysis, I think. Although Ames' term for active power is virtus activus, it very clearly mirrors the typical language that he employs elsewhere, a potentia activa, denoting the power or potency of an agent to actualize a known possible. It's worthwhile noting there's an important distinction here between active potency and passive potency. There's traditional language of God being pure act or pure actuality, and as yet uncreated creatures being in pure potency. Created finite beings who aren't perfect, like some of you in here, are a mixture of potency and act, or potency and actuality. You are changing, you're developing, you can become increasingly actualized, and if you are a Marine, you can be as good as you can be, which would be fully actualized. that kind of language, there is no potency in God. God is pure actuality. But that's a passive potency to become something. What God has is an active potency. God's actuality has the power for other things to be. Ames uses that kind of language. And he recognizes very clearly this distinction between active and passive potency. Namely, active potency is the capacity for acting. Passive potency is the capacity for being acted upon. Potency, he says, quote, is attributed to God actively as he has the power to communicate something to others, such as is the potency or power of the cause. That potency, moreover, is identical with the divine essence. And given the infinitude of God's essence, with God, all things are possible. The divine omnipotence is concerned with absolute possibilities. That whatever God wills, or can will, that's another quote from Ames, by the way. With God, not only with God are all things possible, but the divine omnipotence is concerned with absolute possibilities. Whatever God wills or can will. In this traditional language of distinguishing between absolute power and ordained power, the absolute power of God doesn't mean just omnipotence. I mean, it doesn't mean that God can do anything that God wants to do. And in fact, absolute power is typically not even identified as an operative power. It's the ordained power that's operative. That's what God is doing. The absolute power is the divine active potency over against absolute possibility. God's absolute power is the power that can actualize any genuine possibility. But God doesn't actualize all of them. Very similarly, as Marizes indicates, somewhat more concisely than Ames, that not only are divine ideas known to God in himself as imitable ad extra by creatures, they are also known as such in his absolute power. God knows his ideas to be in his power. This also corresponds with a very specific Thomistic understanding of possibles, inasmuch as Aquinas distinguishes two ways of identifying possibles. On the one hand, there's possibility in the absolute sense, the compatibility of a subject and a predicate. Is this logically possible? Can it be? Can this thing exist as defined by its attributes, the subject corresponding with its predicate? That is intrinsic possibility. On the other hand, there's a sense of the possible as related to the power to accomplish it, namely an extrinsic or relative possibility. The omnipotence of God can be defined as the power of God to accomplish all that is absolutely possible. Like many later Reformed writers of the 17th century, Ames relates possibility not only to the divine essence, but also to the divine power. Not in the sense that God produces possibles by his power, but rather in the sense that possibles, known to God in his essence, as ideas, exemplars, are as intrinsically possible, are also known to God in his power as extrinsically possible. So when you say that there's a divine omnipotence, what you're saying is that the ideas of all possibles are not only in God, but God knows them in his power as actualizable. That is, they are the infinitude of the intrinsically possible corresponds with an infinitude of what for God is extrinsically possible. That's also worth comparing with us, mind you, because there are a lot of things that we can understand as intrinsically possible. like an automobile. We just had to buy a new one. Automobiles are intrinsically possible, but they're not extrinsically possible for me to make. I can't do that. I can do other things. There are an awful lot of intrinsically possible things that are not extrinsically possible for finite creatures. For God, those two kinds of possibility cohere. Corresponding with this understanding of intrinsic and extrinsic possibility, absolute and ordained powers of God, and this parallel distinction between simple intelligence and knowledge of vision. They all fit together here. You know, the absolute power of God corresponds with the simple intelligence by which God knows all these possibilities. The ordained power of God and the knowledge of vision, God knows what he is willing to make and does make, corresponds with those possibles that, because everything is extrinsically possible for God, God actually wills to make. So that to get from, in other words, to get from the absolute power and the simple intelligence that knows all possibility to the ordained power and the knowledge of vision, you have to have not just intrinsic possibility, you have to have extrinsic possibility. And some of what is extrinsically possible, God does in fact actualize. Ames is consistently thinking that way. He distinguishes between divine ideas considered prior to the divine will and divine ideas considered after the determination of God's will. So in each set of distinctions, the will of God intervenes between the terms of the distinctions. The divine ideas prior to the determination of the divine will represent the essences of things, all things that could be actualized, namely pure possibles over against the absolute power of God. Possibles considered intrinsically, albeit possible only because they belong to the divine essence, as imitable by creatures. In other words, there isn't any reservoir of possibles or ideas outside of God on which God draws for his creative work. It all belongs to the divine essence. When the divine ideas are considered after the determination of the divine will, they represent the same essences of things, but now understood as extrinsically possible, as things are to be, quote from Ames, according to their actualized existence, unquote. This account, which is directly related to Ames' understanding of divine freedom, might be understood as a voluntaristic reading of the distinction between knowledge of simple intelligence and knowledge of vision, were it not for Ames' declaration that this will is truly free, since whatever it wills, it does not will by necessity of nature, but by counsel. The freedom of God depends on the ability of his will to operate not by necessity of nature, but according to the divine counsel in which God knows the possibles as intrinsically possible and extrinsically possible for him. There is by implication an intellective judgment that logically precedes the will. Perhaps, even probably, reflecting a development in Aquinas thought that culminated in the Summa, Ames regards divine ideas following the determination of the divine will as exemplars of actual things. There's a significant parallel in Ames' treatise on logic, in which he identifies logic in its execution or operation as an art, and then comments that the idea of art primarily and perfectly and eminently is in the first being from whom all else has emanated, that is, in God. Some final comment on all this. The meditation on the divine knowledge, requisite to the creation of objects ad extra, in Ames' discussion of the counsel of God, has been seen, I think, from the kind of evidence I've talked about, to display a fundamentally Thomistic approach to the ideas or exemplars in the divine essence. Reformed writers who developed this approach did not, at least in the cases I've examined so far, offer an elaboration of the question of divine ideas either as extended or as detailed as is found in Aquinas' various works. Certainly not as detailed as what they might have drawn from Cajetan's commentary on the Summa, which is several times the length of the Summa. What they did was draw on an established argument and appropriate for use in a Reformed context. Nor did Ames' adaptation of a Thomist approach to divine ideas, or you could add a Thomist denial of middle knowledge, predetermine any use of Thomist argumentation on other topics. So Ames is quite free to use and quite free not to use, and by my vote, quite eclectic. This finding is significant for several reasons. In relation to Ames' own theology, which is rather pointedly positioned against both the Jesuit theology of Robert Bellarmine and the synergistic theology of Jacob Arminius, with its clearly Molinist accents, and which also argued against the Suarezian approach to metaphysics, the finding quite clearly indicates not an antipathy to the scholastic tradition and its argumentation, but a very selective appropriation of a particular line of scholastic argumentation that accorded with Ames' own Reformed theological assumptions. In relation to the broader Reformed tradition as developed among Ames' successors, the significance of the finding lies in the fact that Ames' appropriation of a Thomistic understanding of divine ideas was not to be unique to Ames, but had entered Reformed thought earlier in the work of Zanchi and was to become an important element in the argumentation of later Reformed writers like Maastricht as inheritors of an Amesian theological perspective. Given the presence of other inherited assumptions in the scholastic mixture of Ames' thought, such as the definition of theology as practical, it can't be concluded that Ames or other Reformed writers of the era should simply be identified as Thomist, or, for that matter, simply identified as Scotist. What we find here in this one place, arguably, is a modified Thomism and the product of an eclectic reception on the part of the Reformed of an older theological tradition, a tradition that they felt they needed to deal with, not only because they had to argue against Roman Catholic scholastics, but also because it contained a whole series of arguments that buttressed their own theology in a positive way. And all you need to do is begin to look at their reading list to begin to see what's happening. And in Ames' generation, there is this initial appropriation of the best of the older scholastic tradition. In fact, I had a quote that I didn't read to you. Where did I put it? I put it somewhere, which is why I didn't read it in the first place. This is in Ames' Cases of Conscience, and it's on a different topic. Ames is talking about the language of habit or habitus. And he is very clear that he doesn't like certain language that he sees. And he says that the definition of conscience as a disposition or habitus that you find in Scotus, Bonaventure, and Durandus is not proper. It's not good. Instead, he says, as conscience is defined most properly with the best of the schoolmen, it is an act of practical judgment proceeding from the understanding by the power and means of a disposition or habit, which is, again, a rather Thomistic definition. Ames doesn't often talk about his sources, but in one place that he does, he's specifically saying he doesn't want anything to do with Scotus or Bonaventure or Durandus. He doesn't say who he likes. He does say it comes from the best of the schoolmen. And what you see is the intention to appropriate what is viewed as the best of an older tradition. In Ames' generation, it comes largely from a reception of the major scholastic thinkers of the 13th century. As you move forward, you go beyond the 13th century, and in the generation after Ames, there's an increasing appropriation by way of dialogue with what Roman Catholics call second scholasticism, the incredibly detailed scholasticism of the late 16th and the early 17th century. So you move past Ames to people like Futsius, and there's not only appropriation of the 13th century and the 14th, but moving on into the 16th and the 17th century, there's appropriation and there's dialogue. And I think, just to make the point somewhat differently, not only on the topic of divine ideas, but on a whole series of other theological topics, we need to begin examining the Reformed scholastics for their ways of appropriating the older materials, and in fact becoming a part of a continuing conversation. There's an implicit conversation going on in Ames' thought between his Reformed sensibilities and a long tradition of discussion of such topics. And as I said at the beginning, the topic is important. It sounds abstruse, but once you have an ultimate deity beside whom there is no other, and a doctrine of creation ex nihilo, this is a topic that you must deal with. So, anyway, thank you. And I'm happy to take questions, I guess.
Just raise your hand.
Sure.
Speak loudly and clearly if you have any questions. And Dr. Muller will pick hands.
One of the questions, since nobody's asking anything, one of the interesting questions is, does God know intrinsic impossibles? And one of the answers here is that, given that what you're calling intrinsic impossibles are things that simply don't cohere, they're subjects that don't have predicates. They may be predicates that don't have subjects, and they are nothing. So if you ask the question, does God know impossibles, you're actually asking the question, does God know nothing? One of the answers that scholastics generally give is no, God doesn't know impossibles. And somewhere in Baxter, I need to find this again. Baxter is Richard Baxter, that is commenting on something very much like what modern philosophical theologians do when they do their possible world language, and they ask, can God know this? Can God know that? And Baxter says, well, no, God doesn't know impossibles because impossibles are nothing. God doesn't know non-existence because non-existence are nothing. God does, however, know such things insofar as they are thought up in the minds of silly philosophers. I need to find that again. I have a footnote for it somewhere, but I don't know where.
Richard, the analogy that Ames uses of an artist
Mm-hmm.
who has an idea before creating something
Yeah.
out of that idea. That somewhat similar analogy you find elsewhere.
Oh, of course.
With Beza, I'm thinking of,
No.
who says an artist has in mind the end
Mm-hmm.
for creating man before he creates it.
Yeah.
Now, do you see any connection between sort of that double use of the same analogy?
Well, no, I think that analogy, particularly when you're thinking of God as an artisan, as a maker, that's rather intrinsic to a large chunk of the tradition, and finding it basically that again just means that there's this ongoing conversation that uses very similar terms. I think, and most of the people that use it would also then say, however, that there is a difference between God and the artist. And then there again you can tell whether they are more or less Aristotelian Thomistic, because if you were coming off of what you might call an Augustinian illuminationist tradition, such as comes through some of the Franciscans like Bonaventure, you might want to say that the artist has ideas in his head by being basically dropped in by the divine light, so mystically. But if you say, as Ames does, that the human subject, artist or otherwise, has the ideas in his head because he has examined the world around him through his senses and pulled things in, then you've basically got, truth as adequation of the mind of the thing, and you're dealing with a much more sort of Thomistic, quasi-Aristotelian way of thinking, much more a posteriori and inductive, with not need for innate ideas. In fact, when you look for that, innata is not a word you find an awful lot. You do find incita or inditus, so implanted, impressed. And there's that whole notion of, when you get back of that, there's the notion of the mind as a kind of undifferentiated substratum that is very much like materia prima in creation. So God first makes this primary matter and then implants forms onto it. And what your mind does, as having this unformed, like almost materia prima substratum, your mind, via the senses, latches onto the forms that God has already impressed on the materia externally, grabs those forms, pulls them in, impresses them on the substratum. And the more you examine things, the clearer are the ideas in your substratum, and they become increasingly adequated to the thing. I tell students in classes, if you think of yourself at age 5, and how do you find out what a tree is? Well, you might ask your parents what is a tree, but you might just bump into one. And suppose you bump into a maple tree the first time, and you say, "Daddy, what was that?" "Well, that's a tree." And then you bump into a birch tree a little while later, and it looks very different. You say, "Daddy, what's that?" "That's a tree." And gradually you get a much bigger notion of tree in your head just by bumping into things. And the artist is getting the same way according to at least one tradition. The other tradition would have an implanting or an illumination of divine ideas from God, usually ideas of beauty and truth, goodness, and maybe some forms. Very Augustinian. It's not exactly Platonic. When you read Augustine's Confessions, Augustine denies Platonic mimesis. It's not as if your soul remembers ideas from a previous existence. No, your soul has nothing in it except what God implants with the light into the mind. And Augustine very clearly, I think, uses illumination as a Christian alternative to mimesis. So you can do it that way too. And then, then when you get the artist imagery, then you can ask, how do they think the ideas are getting there? And see if you can figure out where the person sits in this broader tradition. Todd?
I have a question from our online audience. Does Ames' approach necessitate a temporal existence of God?
Of course not.
Okay.
In fact, it goes just the other direction. The assumption is that the simple intelligence or absolute understanding by which God knows all possibles is an eternal knowing. the will that comes in between that knowledge and the knowledge of actuals, of the visionary knowledge, is also an eternal willing. And in fact, that language of visionary knowledge or free knowledge, scientia libera, where God knows all actuals, that is not to be understood as a temporal knowledge of actualized things in sequence. It's an eternal knowledge of what God wills. So that, at least the way Ames, I think the way Ames thinks, he doesn't say this at great length, but others do, the divine will eternally wills to actualize the entire universe and its sequence. But that doesn't put God in time. What it does is it places God in direct relationship to all of time without undoing the sequence. I don't know if that answers the question, but no, it definitely doesn't put God in time.
And then one more from that we have. Gentleman asks, how promising a resource is Stephen Charnock's work for exploring these questions?
Well, the quote, the place I said Charnock has some of this is a very small place. Charnock was preaching. I mean, of course, you need to ask yourself, what kind of congregation did Charnock have that they could stand or sit for that long? Particularly, so I don't know if you realize, but Charnock was a very non-dynamic speaker who wore heavy glasses and had his nose in his text. Eye contact only with the words in front of him, probably, not with the congregation. And they sat through the whole thing. But it nonetheless has a very strong homiletical side to it. So that Charnock is one where you can see a more practical outworking of a lot of these ideas. What you don't find in Charnock for the most part is a technical analysis of the ideas. In some places he's more elaborate than others. But he should be used as an example of, a late 17th century Reformed writer who is working through this and doing very nicely in the vernacular.
You mentioned how this idea of the ideas in God related to Molinism. How would it relate also to other views of the divine decree, like the supralapsarian order and the infralapsarian or Amyraldianism?
My guess is that supras, infras, and Amyraldians would all say something very similar. And in fact, some of my Dutch colleagues who've argued about, not only the synchronic contingency question, but this whole late medieval language of a sequence of non-temporal instants of nature, instantes naturae, in the mind of God. All of these ways of looking at divine determination, whether it's supra, infra, Amyraldian, Molinist, they all assume that there is a series of logical priorities in the way God is operating. And of course, the moment you start talking about an ultimate divine knowledge of all possibles in eternity, and a divine knowledge of all to-be-willed actuals, with the divine will intervening, you already have a logical sequence. So that there's a commonality of thought there. And then the question is going to be, in relation to certain questions, like salvation of human beings, how do you prioritize the sequence? So that the difference between infras and supras and Amyraldians is not so much over sequencing in God, it's how they stack the sequence. and in fact, where they place the object of divine knowing into that sequence. So the object of divine knowing with regard to the elect and the reprobate, the infralapsarian is going to place it very specifically into the divine knowledge of all actuality, and particularly after the fall. The super is going to ask the question, shouldn't I be thinking about the ultimate realm of possibility where God can know that the ultimate idea in his mind is the exemplar for a whole series of human beings? They're possibles, and God is going to will some of those possibles into existence and others not. And some of the possibles that God wills into existence from a super perspective are going to be reprobates. The argument that you sometimes find, and you see it in Arminius, and you see it being picked up, interestingly, by some infralapsarians. This may come as a shock to some folks, but there is an overlap between Reformed infralapsarian argumentation and Arminian argumentation. Some of the arguments that Arminius uses against supras are used by infras against supras as well. You see it in Dumoulin. Dumoulin actually has some argumentative lines in common with Arminius, where, and Puritan does too, by the way, where they don't like the super argument on the ground that mere possibles cannot be objects of willing. A super response to that is, if mere possibles can't be an object of willing, how does God actualize anything? Of course mere possibles can be objects of divine willing. They have to be objects of divine willing, because everything starts as a possible that God will, at some point, wills into being. So no, it's the structure of logical priorities in God. That's a commonality of this era, whereas how you identify it as relating to particular points in theology, that's going to make the difference. And then, of course, the Molinists with middle knowledge add a whole other kind of divine knowing, which Ames notes is not possible. Todd?
What does Ames think on the role of human free will in divine knowledge, both the simple knowledge and the willed knowledge? Is there any difference with that of Aquinas?
Well, when you come, that depends on where you want to find the difference. My sense is that, and people would disagree with me about this, but I do think that most of the Christian tradition, including Aquinas and including Scotus and including most of the 17th century Reformed Orthodox, assumes that human freedom is constituted by liberties of contradiction and liberties of contrariety. And as I say, here I am standing in front of you, holding my glasses in my hand. It belongs perfectly to my liberty that I don't hold the glasses in my hand. And in fact, at this very moment, when I am holding the glasses in my hand, I still have the potency not to hold them in my hand. I can't hold them in my hand and not hold them in my hand at the same time, but in this moment, I have a potency to hold them, which I'm actualizing, and a potency not to hold them, which I just did actualize. I think Ames will agree with Aquinas on that one. The question is, how do you further define the nature of that liberty? Does the liberty arise out of the ability of the will to reject objects presented by the intellect? Ames may say yes. Aquinas would say no. Puritan says no. And whereas I'm not totally sure about Ames, I am quite certain that Aquinas gives you a Thomistic answer on that point. That the will necessarily follows the last determinate judgment of the practical intellect. the will is not coerced to do that, but the will does it freely, spontaneously. Where does the alternativity come from in that model? The alternativity comes in the ability of the intellect freely to determine which object it views as the good to be chosen by the will. That's Puritan, that's Aquinas. I'm not quite sure about Ames. And some of the Reformed do think that the will can reject the last determinate judgment of the practical intellect. I think Buchanan does. Which, by the way, that is Scotist, or Franciscan generally. You can throw in William de la Mare in there if you like. Okay? Anton?
In William Ames, in what ways does God know or not know evil?
God obviously, well, you can't know evil as a thing either. God doesn't know evil as a thing. God doesn't know evil as a substance. Evil isn't something that God creates out of nothing, at least if you adhere to an Augustinian model. What God does know are the defective acts and natures of creatures. So that the evil that God knows belongs to the evil nature and evil willing of creatures. And that does belong to both his foreknowledge, as you could call it, and to his knowledge of individual human possibles to be actualized. But God doesn't know these as imperfections in his own ideas. He knows them as distortions in the creatures. The only other alternative is to understand evil as stuff, as substance. And then if you have God creating nothing but good, then you have to end up either with no explanation for evil, or with evil as an alternative substance out there. And then you're probably getting away from creation ex nihilo. You're getting into the eternal existence of matter that has a certain kind of recalcitrancy, that when God tries to create anything, there's a kind of negativity and resistance about the materiality, and you're entering some kind of dualistic mode. So yeah, evil isn't stuff that is to be known. Well, oh, one more?
Does Ames discuss the issue of basically why aren't all the possibilities, the intrinsic possibilities that God knows, right? Why aren't they actualized?
God simply doesn't will to do so. And for the people, there are two lines of argumentation in Western philosophy. One belongs to what Arthur Lovejoy, in his book The Great Chain of Being, called the principle of plenitude. And the principle of plenitude assumes that all possibles will be actualized. And then you do end up having a radically determined universe. And when you insert the idea of God into that, then God necessarily wills all things, period, without any possibility of willing anything else or of leaving anything out. God necessarily wills that the world necessarily be the way it is, and it could be no other, period. Whereas the other model, which denies the principle of plenitude, assumes that God does not need to actualize all possibles, which leaves God free, and also in a radical way renders the entire created order contingent. Now, within the created order, you do have things that occur by necessity in terms of the order itself. You have natural causes that operate the same way quite consistently. There's a necessary causality there. But you also have contingencies and free acts. And if you ask in an ultimate ontic way, how can you have contingencies and free acts in this order? In the ultimate ontic sense, it's because the order itself as a whole could be otherwise if God so willed. And then your own freedom, understood as a species of contingency, arises the same way, that what you are doing could be otherwise. And then of course, and there are a variety of different ways of parsing that. But if you don't back it off into the divine and have an understanding that God only wills into existence those possibles that he chooses to actualize, then you end up with a radically deterministic model. That nothing could be otherwise than what it is, period.
I'm just wondering whether or not, because you talked about sort of a passive potentiality, active potentiality.
No.
God.
Well, potency is the source of actuality and actualization. I mean, it's active when it brings things into being as a cause. It's passive when it's there and can be acted upon. So that in any time you act to change something, that something that you're changing has a potency to be otherwise. And in the ultimate sense, materiality has that. Or if you think in terms of the old model of prime matter, the undifferentiated stuff that God first makes, that is almost absolute potentiality. It can be anything that God wants to make it. That's passive potency, and it's not active. You know, if you think about creation, and if you do in fact have the sense of a first moment of creation when God creates materiality, and then a second act of creation where God brings about things by informing the materiality, that initial materiality cannot do anything. You know, pure materiality can't make itself into horses and cats. It's just potency. And then you have to have the active potency to cause the being of things. So, of course, and potentia is one word that you sometimes translate as power, sometimes you translate as potency, and other times you translate it as potential, depending on the context.
We got one final question for you. Have you ever written on the so-called problem of evil that you're addressing now? And as a follow-up, have you ever discussed that issue with Dr. James Greer before he died?
And no to both questions.
Okay. Well, why don't we thank our speaker, and I'm sure he'll be around for a little bit if you have questions. Catch up with him afterwards. Thank you, Dr. Muller.
Thank you.